Everyone. My name is Holly Mosher, and I wanted to welcome you all to a call generously hosted by Marion Eddy of the Threshold Foundation and Kenny Bruno from Cloud Mountain Foundation. I'm here to moderate a very exciting call with Marilyn Marks of the Coalition for Good Governance and Susan Greenhalgh of Free Speech for People. On today's call, we will share shocking information that came up during the years-old Georgia lawsuit Curling versus Raffensperger that was originally won, the result of which was Diebold machines were replaced by Dominion machines. Judge Amy Totenberg is the judge on this case. What has been revealed during the continuation and further discovery of this case is shocking information of a multi-state conspiracy to copy and disseminate Dominion election software, thus creating a huge security breach by insiders. Since the software was unlawfully copied, Raffensperger and the state elections board's original and standing claim of physical security has now shown to be completely thrown out the window, since the election software has been accessed by multiple unauthorized people across state lines. It has been over a year since Marilyn Marks uncovered this extraordinary information during discovery on the case. This information was uncovered and put into context only by the hard work and tireless dedicated efforts of Coalition for Good Governance and Free Speech for People. We are here today because they are trying to raise awareness and are objecting to the fact that nothing has happened to curtail this serious breach. This breach has significant bearing on the integrity and security of our elections. The election software was unlawfully taken by several players in multiple states, including Georgia, Michigan, Colorado, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And there were attempts in Nevada as well. Those associated with the Trump campaign have gained access to voting software from both Dominion and ES&S. You may not know, together, these two vendors are used to count 70% of votes in the United States. Although news reports are beginning to reveal efforts to take voting system software in different states, the Coalition for Good Governance lawsuit discovered key evidence that shows that many of these efforts, including in Georgia, were being coordinated across state lines by Trump lawyers Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, Michael Flynn, as well as far-right extremists, cyber ninjas, and Stop the Steal. This information has been reported on by the mainstream media, by CNN, AP, Washington Post, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but last fall, and then now again last week. But it has not received the attention from law enforcement and the entities that work to protect our elections. Most people are well aware of the plot promoted by Donald Trump to use the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense to seize voting equipment. This plot was outlined in a draft executive order that was widely reported on, but not enacted. Less known is the fact that Trump and his allies also discussed a plan to access voting machines through cooperation of complicit election officials, and this plan was carried out successfully. And by successfully, we mean that Trump and his campaign obtained copies of voting software used all over the country. They shared it covertly with their network, and they still have it today. The software was even used in a presentation at CPAC to further support false claims that Trump won the election. The efforts to take voting software from multiple states, most successfully in Coffee County, Georgia, was uncovered not by the FBI or Georgia law enforcement, the Secretary of State, or other election officials, but only because the Coalition for Good Governance had an ongoing lawsuit where this was found out in discovery and at great expense and effort to the plaintiffs. So we hope you enjoy hearing in great detail from Marilyn and Susan, and Oski will share, you can share your comments and questions in the chat. And then we will give you time after each speaker to also ask any questions that you have. So with this, I turn it over to Marilyn.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm Marilyn Marks, Executive Director of Coalition for Good Governance. And thank you so much, Cloud Mountain and Threshold, for hosting us today and showing us your support. Eski, do you mind going ahead and putting up the slide? Okay. Well, I've named my presentation, Lordy, I hope there are tapes. And it'll become clear as to why we have that name when we tell you a little bit more about our experience here. Let's go to the next slide, Eski. Okay. What we uncovered and exposed. It has been incredibly hard work over the last year and a half, where we have bit by bit uncovered evidence of this trail that goes from the White House down to Coffee County, Georgia, where all of the Georgia software was taken and copied in an unauthorized manner. This was the largest voting system breach in US history. The path goes from the White House to Coffee County. And I want to tell you more about why the story doesn't end there, and that instead, this is a huge risk to future elections, which is what our lawsuit is trying to remedy. I'm not going to tell you the story in the way that we learned it, because we've learned it in bits and pieces since March 7th, 2021. And all the bits and pieces make no chronological sense. We'll tell you the story that happened, and then we want to come back and tell you what our part in it is and how you can help. So let's go to the next slide. How did this craziness begin? Oski, let's hear the phone call I got.
And I haven't, you know, I'm the guy that chartered the jet to go down to Coffee County to have them inspect all of those computers, and I've heard zero. Okay? I went down there, we scanned every freaking ballot, and the elections director and her assistant lost their job. Okay? And have yet learned zero about all of that effort.
Well, why did they not give you any information?
That's a great question as to why all of that data, we haven't had a report from anybody. And I keep saying, guys, all of that effort, you know, the same people that went up to Michigan, okay, and did all that forensic stuff on the computers, and they sent their team down to Coffee County, Georgia, and they scanned all the equipment, imaged all the hard drives, and scanned every single ballot. You know, absentee in person, and absentee by mail.
Okay, so from there, that was March 2021. And I started trying to dig around and find any evidence of this, and started talking to reporters. And during that entire year, I could get no one to listen. I even found an old text message that I had sent to a national reporter in April of 2021 that said, I think this is real, and I think it's going to end up going all the way to Sidney Powell, that we're going to find out that Sidney Powell was behind some of this nonsense. Well, I should have never sent text messages like that, because the reporters just didn't believe me. We were in the middle of a lawsuit, but discovery hadn't opened yet. We opened discovery, and we continued to ask the state Secretary of State and the state election board, tell us anything you know about unauthorized access, anybody copying the equipment. They kept denying no such thing happened, no such thing happened. Finally, in Gabe Sterling's deposition, we played that tape. That Gabe Sterling deposition was in February, but in April, he was still saying this. Let's play it, Oski.
So we're still dealing with that here, and we still have to prove negatives in all these cases. It's similar across the board. But like, we had claims, even recently, there was people saying, we went to Coffee County, and we imaged everything. There's no evidence of any of that. It didn't happen.
Well, it did happen. Let's go to the next slide. So we began to, both through open records requests before discovery opened and during discovery, in March, in June, in July, they kept telling us, oh, there are no videos. We kept asking, surely there's some videos. We had hints that there were videos. And they kept denying. The state was denying, the county was denying, the board of directors, board of elections was denying there were any videos. August 26th, the exterior videos suddenly appeared. And CNN, Washington Post, began to cover these videos. I'm sure you must have seen them at the time. And then on September the 16th, the next explosion, the interior videos were found, and people who had testified that they were not even in the room, knew nothing about this. Suddenly we find there are tapes and they're in the room. Let's play the CNN clip, Ezgi.
The newly obtained surveillance video shows a Republican county official and a team of operatives working for Trump attorney Sidney Powell inside a restricted area of the local elections office in Coffee County, Georgia. Among those seen, Kathy Latham, a former GOP chairwoman of Coffee County, who is under criminal investigation for posing as a fake elector in 2020. Latham previously claimed she was not personally involved in the breach, but the video appears to undercut that claim, showing her inside as a team of Republican operatives work on computers near election equipment and proceed to access voting data. Scott Hall, an Atlanta bail bondsman and Fulton County Republican poll watcher, is one of the people who spent hours inside the restricted area, and in audio obtained by CNN, Hall later described what he did.
I'm the guy that chartered the jet to go down to Coffee County to have them inspect all of those computers, and I've heard zero. Okay? I went down there, we scanned every freaking ballot.
The Georgia Secretary of State's office calls what happened in Coffee County criminal behavior, and a state criminal investigation is underway. But election experts say the damage could be even bigger than the illegal accessing of voting equipment in Georgia and other parts of the country. These operatives may be undermining the security of elections in the future.
And that last point is the point that we really want to underscore here. In fact, those operatives have indeed undermined the security of the 2024 election and other elections between now and then. Again, CNN has these videos because we extracted them after we were told so many times that no such thing exists. All right, how in the world though, let's go to the next slide. How in the world did Coffee County become the county where this voting, the largest voting system breach in US history was done? It starts at Tomotley, Linwood's Plantation. Then we go to the planning after the election was lost in December, the war room at the Willard Hotel. Susan is going to tell you about the planning that went on at the White House, and then what happened in Coffee County. So let me tell you a little bit about Coffee County, starting with the next slide. Well, Coffee County probably became of interest at Linwood's Plantation in South Carolina right after the election, when Sidney Powell and Linwood and Mike Flynn, and you've heard of this probably, how they gathered there for various parts of the month of November, including Doug Logan of Cyber Ninjas, and began to determine that they wanted to get access to to Georgia software. They were not able to make it happen then. The next time that we know that they began to focus on it more was the Willard Hotel. And let's look at the next slide. At the Willard Hotel, you've heard of the war room there. In the war room, there were people like Flynn, Giuliani, and Coffee County GOP Chair Kathy Latham, whose name you've now heard a few times. And it turns out that more detailed planning got done about Coffee County at that war room. The next place that we're going to jump to Coffee County. And in Coffee County, when they finally got there, and this was on January 7th, 2021, they were able to have access to everything, including what you're seeing here is them copying the central brains of the Coffee County system, but it was the software for the entire state that they are copying to the Sullivan Strickler people out of Georgia. The next slide shows that they were actually copying the January 7th US Senate runoff memory cards, as well as all the software on the server. And so this came out of our discovery as we took the deposition of Sullivan Strickler, people who did it. Let's go to the next slide. That shows the first breach you just saw was January 7th. The next breach, there were two more breaches, one in the 18th and 19th of January, and then the next one, the 25th through the 29th. Cyber Ninjas, there on the 18th and 19th, and then colleague Jeff Lindbergh was there the 25th through the 29th, testing the machines and literally changing the date and time on the server. I mean, absolutely tampering with the central brains of the system. Let me turn it over to Susan for a few minutes to tell you about what happened at the White House to get to Coffee County. Susan has been an incredible resource for us. She is a consulting expert on our case. She sat through all the depositions, and she and I work together every day, and she and I have dug this stuff out, no matter how many times people told us we'd never find it. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thanks, Marilyn. And I'd like to give an incredible shout out to the work that Coalition for Good Governance and the curling plaintiffs have done to uncover all of this information. So as Marilyn mentioned, I'm a consulting expert for the lawsuit. So I was qualified by the judge, which means that I get to see all of the documents, even ones that are for the attorneys. Although Free Speech for People is not a party to the lawsuit, we're not a plaintiff or counsel. I've been helping the attorneys kind of see the information when it relates to the national picture. As a national election security person or expert, I will say I can kind of shed light on the national perspective. So Marilyn and her team were uncovering a lot of incredible information. The other experts and myself were poring over documents and watching the depositions. And last November, as Marilyn mentioned, they uncovered information that Doug Logan, we can go to the next slide, Oski, please. Doug Logan and Jeffrey Lindbergh were part of this security breach in Coffee County and part of accessing the systems and messing around with them, for want of a better term. There they are entering the elections office. We can go to the next slide, Oski. You might recognize Doug Logan. He is well known as being the head of Cyber Ninjas, who ran the quote unquote fraud it or fake audit out in Arizona. He is known to be a big supporter of election denialism and stop the steal lies about the election. So this was a guy that was in Coffee County. And because of the work that Marilyn did, that they petitioned the court, they were able to take his deposition and Jeffrey Lindbergh's deposition. And while we were listening to the depositions, the attorneys were asking, have you been contacted by the FBI? Have you been contacted by the special counsel? Have you been contacted by the Department of Justice? And each of these guys said no across the board. And it was clear they didn't even think that they should be. They didn't think they'd done anything wrong, even though we know that there are some potential laws that may have been violated here. And this concerned me greatly. With my national lens, I thought this is a real problem because we know that this was a multi-state enterprise, that they had, that Maryland's lawsuit uncovered one very, very key piece of information, which is the contract that Sidney Powell had engaged in with the people that went to Coffee County showed that they had also been engaged to go to Nevada and Michigan to do the same thing. From what we know, we don't think they succeeded in Nevada, but we do understand that they succeeded in Michigan. So that means that this whole thing starts to cross state lines. That should implicate federal law enforcement and federal investigation. But from what these two testified at the very end of November last year in 2022, no one had contacted them. I went back to our legal team and shared this information, and we determined that it made sense to send a letter to the Department of Justice, to the special counsel, to the FBI, as well as to the Department of Homeland Security, detailing the information that Maryland's team had uncovered. So we can go to the next slide, Oski. So we wrote a letter which was extremely detailed. It cited to the evidence that had been filed in Maryland's case that was on the docket that's should have hopefully been compelling, that showed that this was a multi-state plan and plot. And we got this reported in the Washington Post and thought, okay, well, now we've given them all the information. It's in the press. They're going to get a little pressure. We hopefully now we know that this information will get out there and the right people will start looking at it. And frankly, I had thought after the stuff hit the front page of the Washington Post over the summer with the videos of the people going in to copy software that it would have prompted the federal investigation, but because of the testimony from Logan and Lindbergh that they were not being questioned, we felt confident they were not investigating. And unfortunately, our fears seem to be confirmed. We can go to the next slide, Oski, in that we got a letter back from the FBI and Department of Justice a couple months later. And it in essence confirmed that they are not investigating, and they gave us some reasoning that they needed to be invited in by local authorities. That answer doesn't really hold water in light of information, in light of the mission of the federal government to enforce federal laws, but also that we know that the state election board had noticed this to the FBI and said, we think this might be a multi-state plan and you should be looking at it. So we were extremely disappointed to see that the FBI did not seem to be taking this seriously. We can go to the next slide, Oski. So we brought this also to the press. We raised the story of the press. We got more attention to it as well. And while we were doing that, I started to go back and research information from the January 6th committee. So we can go to the next slide. As I'm sure you all know, there were so much information that was taken from the committee, and that those deposition transcripts were all published at the end of last year, early January, as well as some other evidence from the committee. And after pouring through those transcripts, it became clear that this plot to access voting machines in Coffee County was actually discussed in the Oval Office with Donald Trump. We can go to the next slide, please. So the testimony that made this clear, in addition to from Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, came from staff attorney Derek Lyons, also counselor, where he described that there were two plans to access voting machines. The first one, as we've mentioned, the executive order to have the federal government and the DHS and DOD go in and seize voting equipment. And that was rejected very vociferously by White House counsel, saying you'll have riots in the streets. So they didn't try and go forward with that plan, but there was a second plan, which was to get access to the voting machines from complicit election officials. And that's where we start to see the through line from the White House directly down to Coffee County. We can go to the next slide, please. So we wrote another letter, and this one got picked up last week in the New York Times. You might have seen that story. We have also shared a handout with all of the key stories, the key news stories, because there's so much information to digest. So we thought that might be helpful if you want to kind of go back and peruse later on. So the New York Times covered this information, and we can go to the next slide. And MSNBC also did a really amazing segment on Monday about it. We've gotten some other press hits as well. CNN has also been covering this, as well as some more information that Marilyn will share with you. So I'm going to turn it back to Marilyn just to kind of summarizes the work that Free Speech for People is doing to put this all in context in the federal lens, and to try and get the federal government to understand the breadth of this information and its meaning, and to spur some action from them.
Thanks. And it has truly been a team effort. You know, Susan and I'll read these transcripts and call each other, good Lord, 10 times a day, probably going, look at page 10. Do you think that relates to this thing that we saw over here in this guy's deposition? And this has been putting together puzzle pieces, and then we deliver it to the press as best we can. And that is how the world gets to know of this information. Also, I should say, in terms of the depth of our teamwork, Donna Curling lent her name, or continues to lend her name, to this lawsuit. And we have two groups of plaintiffs, the Curling plaintiffs and the coalition plaintiffs. And we are very much partnered in this case against the state. And Donna Curling was able to recruit some incredible lawyers. She has a team of lawyers. We have a team of lawyers, and it's all functions as one big team. But they, just like Susan, have made unbelievable contributions to this team effort that's still going forward in the courts, and hopefully we'll get to trial this year. But the voting system breach that we are telling you about is the very thing that creates so much unmitigated risk that the case is trying to say must be mitigated. And we've already talked about the fact that it accessed all components, not just Coffee County or the brains of the system. Let's go forward a couple of slides to what the dangers are. Right, no, that's great. The one you had was perfect. All right, I won't go through all the details, but everybody says, well, what can they do with software they got from 2020? What they can do is create malware, practice on the virtual machine that Doug Logan set up when he put this software online for lots of different bad actors to work with, and to create malware, perfect it, and then use it to deploy in future elections. I've listed lots of different options as to where malware can be put into the system to impact future elections. We'll be happy to give you these slides, and you can see the wide variety of options, unfortunately, for infecting future elections. Let's go to the next slide. Oski. Again, the system today is not secure, particularly because touchscreen machines are used in Georgia and without a trustworthy paper trail that can be audited. That's what we want to see for 2024 and beyond. Hand-marked paper ballots counted by optical scanners and audited. Let's go to the next slide. That's what will save the future, the elections from future risk. Why aren't the state officials doing anything, federal officials? Susan talked a lot about the federal officials. The breach is very embarrassing to the Secretary of State. Raffensperger said it cannot happen. It did not happen. Obviously, it did happen. And as I said, 70% of the nation gets it right using hand-marked paper ballots and scanning them. Now, most states are not auditing, as all of you probably know, the way they should. Georgia needs to adopt hand-marked paper ballots and audits more robust than other states are doing, and other states need to improve their audit requirements. But that's the core issue with our case. You want to go to the next slide? What can you do now? We're all facing 2024 as concerned voters. Urge your political leaders to recognize the risk. We have to get over this idea that we can't talk about voting system risk just because it was a very controversial topic in 2020. We don't want it to be an even more controversial topic in 2024. Talk to your political leaders to ask them to recognize this risk and start working to mitigate it. Because of the reasons that Susan just explained, members of Congress need to ask for the DOJ's involvement in investigation, and I believe Senate investigations need to be conducted. The press coverage, particularly in Georgia. Georgia press has only given minimal coverage to this Georgia-centric story. They get a hard time from the Secretary of State when they do, but Georgia press needs to cover this a lot more, explaining the risk to the people. And of course, we would ask you to support the curling litigation. We are operating on a shoestring. We thought we were going to have a 2 to 6 month lawsuit. We've been in this 6 years now. We won the first part of this lawsuit and got rid of the paperless machines. And now we're trying to get rid of their worst cousin, the touchscreen machines with untrustworthy paper. We had great success in the courts, but it's been a very slow battle, and the state is really fighting back with everything they have. So we need every bit of support that we can get from foundations, from voters, and everybody in between. But thank you for the support that you have given us. I know you probably have lots of questions, and Holly will handle those, but on the next slide, I put my contact information, and please let me hear from you. I'm happy to send you a copy of our presentation, and happy to answer any questions that you have about what we're doing if you don't get a chance to ask them today. Thank you, Holly. Holly, I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry, thank you. I said I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, so please add them there. But to start off, I would ask this first question. You know, this is all very concerning about the 2020 election, but what does this mean for 2024 and going forward?
You know, I would love to hear Susan's input on this as well, but I am beyond alarmed because the solutions are simple. They are cheap and they're simple. In Georgia, all that we need to do is put the touchscreens in the closet, certainly use them for people who don't need the accessibility features. But for the vast majority of the public, hand mark the paper ballot, optical scan, audit the results. It's a very simple solution. It costs less. But we are going to have to convince election officials that those things are necessary and that these breaches definitely have give the bad actors the very easy opportunity to manipulate the system or completely disrupt it. You know, I could even probably write software that would totally disrupt the system, even though I couldn't flip the votes. But I think that's a good question for Susan too, because she really sees this from a national lens, and I tend to look at it from Georgia up.
Yeah, one of the things that the computer scientists, or a couple of things the computer scientists that we've talked to about this have warned about is using this to fabricate evidence. In the 2020 election contests that were raised by the Trump campaign, they kept running into a problem that they didn't have any evidence. And having software that you can use and pretend or make fabricate evidence could be a problem. This could be used to in disinformation campaigns, as we saw is already happening in CPAC. And could, as Marilyn said, the worst case scenario is to use the software to create malware, which could be deployed to actually an attack an election.